The sheriff's son grew up hunting outlaws until he learned his real father was the man on the wanted poster. What would you do if you discovered the man you've been hunting your entire life was your own father? Thomas McCain grew up believing in justice, black and white, good versus evil, with a deputy's badge on his chest and his father's teachings in his heart. He tracked the most notorious outlaw in 3 territories. But when he finally cornered Black Jack Morrison in that abandoned mine, when their eyes met across 20 years of secrets and lies, Thomas discovered that some truths are too heavy for one man to carry. This is the story of son who learned that being a man isn't about the blood in your veins. It's about the choices you make when the whole world is watching. Welcome to the Sheriff's Son, a forgotten legend of the American West. The sun rose like a judgment over Willow Creek, painting the dusty street gold and red. Thomas McCain stood in the doorway of the jailhouse, bare feet planted on wooden boards that had drunk 20 years of desert wind. His eyes followed every movement as Sheriff McCain hammered another wanted poster into the weathered door. The boy's heart beat like a drum against his ribs. "Who's that one, Pa?" Thomas asked, pointing at the fresh paper. Sheriff McCain stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The hammer hung loose in his grip, heavy as the badge on his chest. "Billy Turner. Robbed a stagecoach up near Canyon Ridge. Shot the driver for sport." Thomas studied the rough sketch on the poster. The man's eyes looked mean, even drawn in black ink on yellowed paper. The boy's fingers found the toy badge McCain had carved for him from a piece of tin. He wore it every day, pinned to his cotton shirt like a promise. "When I grow up, I'm going to catch him," Thomas said. His voice carried the certainty that only lived in the hearts of 12-year-old boys who still believed the world was split clean between good and evil. McCain's weathered face softened. He reached down and ruffled Thomas's dark hair, the same way he had every morning for as long as the boy could remember. "That's what lawmen do, son. We catch the bad ones so the good folks can sleep safe." The boy pressed his face against the rough wood of the door, reading every poster with the hunger of someone learning scripture. Jesse Barnes, wanted for cattle rustling. Sam Wheeler, murderer and thief. And there, in the top right corner, a poster that looked older than the rest. The paper had gone brown at the edges, and the ink had faded to the color of old blood. Jack Morrison, it read in bold letters. Known as Black Jack, wanted dead or alive for bank robbery, murder, and crimes against the territory. Reward, $500. Thomas had seen that poster 100 times, but today something was different. Today, McCain's eyes lingered on it like a man looking at a grave he dug with his own hands. "Pa, who's Black Jack Morrison?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. McCain's shoulders went tight, and for a moment, Thomas thought his father might not answer at all. "The worst kind of outlaw," McCain said finally. His voice came out rough, like words scraped over stone. "Been running wild for 20 years or more. Him and his gang hit banks from here to Colorado territory." Thomas squinted at the faded drawing. The man in the picture had dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through the paper. Something in that face made the boy's chest feel strange, like a bird was trapped inside his ribs. "Have you ever seen him? In real life, I mean." McCain turned away, walking back toward his desk with steps that seemed heavier than they should be. "Once, long time ago." The boy followed him inside, where the air was cooler and smelled of coffee and old leather. McCain's office was small but neat. A rifle hung on the wall, next to a map of the territory marked with red pins where crimes had been reported. Thomas knew every inch of that room. He had spent countless hours sitting on the floor, playing with carved wooden horses while McCain worked at his desk. "Tell me about him," Thomas said, settling onto his favorite spot on the rug. McCain poured coffee from a dented pot, his hands steady despite the weight Thomas could see pressing down on his shoulders. "Not much to tell. Some men choose the wrong path and can't find their way back. But why? Why do they choose to be bad?" The question made McCain pause, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He stared out the window at the street where dust devils danced between the buildings like ghosts of things that used to be. "Sometimes a man makes one mistake," McCain said slowly, "and that mistake leads to another. Before he knows it, He's so far down the wrong road that he can't see his way home. Thomas pulled his knees up to his chest, thinking hard. But couldn't he just turn around? Just decide to be good again? Maybe. If he had something worth turning around for. The boy didn't understand the sadness in his father's voice, but he felt it like a cold wind that found its way through the walls. He watched McCain walk to the window and stare out at nothing, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Pa, did Black Jack Morrison ever have a family? The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as McCain set it down. For a long moment, the only sound was the tick of the old clock on the wall, counting out seconds that felt heavy as stones. I don't know, son. I suppose most men do, somewhere along the way. Thomas stood up and walked to where McCain stood. Even at 12, he barely came up to his father's elbow. McCain was a tall man, built strong from years of hard work and harder choices. His hands were scarred from a lifetime of fixing things and fighting things and holding on to things that mattered. If I ever met Black Jack Morrison, I'd arrest him myself, Thomas declared. I'd put him in jail and make sure he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. McCain looked down at the boy, and Thomas saw something in his father's eyes that he'd never seen before. It looked like fear, but fear mixed with something else. Something that might have been love or might have been regret. That's what lawmen do, McCain said quietly. We protect people from the darkness. The afternoons stretched long and lazy, and Thomas spent it the way he always did when McCain was working. He sat on the jailhouse steps, carving a piece of wood with the small knife McCain had given him for his birthday. He was making a horse, though it looked more like a dog with too many legs. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, McCain came outside and sat beside him. They didn't speak for a while, just watched the town settle into evening. Mrs. Henderson swept her porch across the street. Old Pete led his mule toward the livery stable. Children chased each other around the water trough, their laughter carrying on the warm air. Thomas, McCain said finally, what makes a good lawman? The boy thought about it, turning the wooden horse over in his hands. Being brave, that's part of it. What else? Being fair, yes. And Thomas looked at his father's face, trying to read the lesson hidden there like tracks in hard ground. Knowing right from wrong? McCain nodded slowly. And sometimes, son, knowing right from wrong is the hardest thing a man can do. The stars were coming out, tiny pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Thomas leaned against McCain's shoulder, feeling safe in the circle of his father's presence. He didn't understand why McCain seemed sad tonight, or why he kept looking at that old wanted poster like it held secrets too heavy to carry. But he understood that he wanted to be just like the man beside him, strong and good and brave. A man who stood between the darkness and the light, keeping watch over those who couldn't keep watch over themselves. As they sat in the growing dark, neither of them noticed the rider who paused at the edge of town, his horse stamping impatiently in the dust. The man's face was hidden by the brim of his hat, but his eyes found the jailhouse like a compass finds north. He studied the building for a long time, and when the wind shifted, it carried the sound of a boy's laughter across the desert silence. The rider's shoulders stiffened, and something that might have been pain crossed his weathered features. After a moment, he turned his horse and disappeared into the night, leaving only hoofprints in the sand and questions that had no answers. Thomas yawned and stretched, ready for bed and dreams of silver badges and justice served. He had no way of knowing that the man who'd been watching them carried the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same restless spirit that burned like a flame in the boy's chest. And McCain, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down like stones, wondered if the time for truth was finally coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The desert stretched before them like a sea of broken promises, endless and unforgiving under the weight of an August sun. Thomas McCain rode beside the man who had raised him, his deputy's badge pinned to a vest that had grown tight across shoulders broadened by 6 years of hard work and harder choices. At 18, he had grown tall enough to look Sheriff McCain in the eye, though he still saw his father as the giant who had taught him the difference between right and wrong. Their horses moved at a steady pace across the wasteland, hooves finding purchase on rocks worn smooth by wind and time. Behind them, two more deputies followed, their faces grim beneath the brims of their hats. They had been tracking Black Jack Morrison's gang for 3 days, following a trail of blood and stolen gold that led deeper into the Badlands with each passing hour. Water's getting low. Deputy Carson called from behind them, his voice carried away by the wind almost before it reached their ears. McCain raised his hand, and the small posse pulled their horses to a stop beside a cluster of Joshua trees that offered the only shade for miles. Thomas dismounted and checked his water bottle, feeling the liquid slosh against the metal with a sound that spoke of careful rationing and longer trails ahead. "How far to Copper Canyon?" Thomas asked, squinting at the horizon where heat waves danced like spirits over the red rocks. "Another day's hard ride," McCain replied, but his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with distance. "Maybe less if we push through the night." Thomas had noticed the change in McCain over the past few days. Ever since word had come that Black Jack Morrison's gang had hit the bank in Silver Springs, his father had grown quiet and distant, like a man carrying secrets too heavy for one set of shoulders. "Pa," Thomas said quietly, stepping close enough that the others couldn't hear. "You sure about this? We could wait for the federal marshals to come up from Tucson." McCain's weathered hands gripped his reins tighter, knuckles white against the leather. "We've been chasing this ghost for too long, son. Time to finish it." The boy in Thomas wanted to ask more questions, but the deputy in him knew when to stay silent. They mounted up again and rode deeper into the wilderness, where the only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the whisper of wind through stone. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they found the mine. It sat in the shadow of a red cliff like a wound in the earth, its entrance dark and forbidding. Broken timbers lay scattered around the opening, and the tracks they had been following led straight into the darkness. "They're in there," Deputy Blake whispered, pointing to fresh horse droppings near the entrance. "Can't be more than a few hours ahead of us." McCain dismounted and checked his rifle, the click of metal on metal sharp in the desert silence. Thomas felt his heart beat faster, the way it always did before trouble found them. This was what he had dreamed of as a boy sitting on the jailhouse steps. This was justice waiting to be served. "Carson, Blake, you take the back in trance," McCain ordered quietly. "Thomas and I go in the front. Give us 10 minutes, then move in slow and quiet." The two deputies nodded and disappeared around the side of the cliff, their boots silent on the rocky ground. Thomas and McCain stood alone at the mouth of the mine, staring into darkness that seemed to reach out for them with invisible fingers. "Son," McCain said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, "whatever happens in there, I want you to remember something. Sometimes the world ain't as simple as we want it to be. Sometimes good men make bad choices, and bad men make good ones. Remember that." Thomas looked at his father, seeing something in McCain's eyes that made his chest feel tight. Fear, maybe, or regret. "Pa, what are you trying to tell me?" But McCain was already moving into the mine, his rifle ready and his steps careful on the loose rocks that covered the ground. Thomas followed, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol, ready for whatever waited in the darkness. The mine shaft stretched deeper than Thomas had expected, supported by rotting timbers that groaned like old bones in the wind. Their boots echoed off the stone walls, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the murmur of voices and the stamp of restless horses. Light flickered ahead, orange and warm against the cold stone. McCain held up his hand, and they stopped, listening to the voices that drifted through the darkness like smoke. "Should have headed for Mexico when we had the chance," one voice said, rough with tobacco and years of hard living. "Shut up, Pete. We got enough gold to last us through winter if we're careful about it." And then another voice, deeper than the others, carrying an authority that made men listen whether they wanted to or not. "We stay here tonight. Move out at first light. Sheriff won't follow us this deep into the Badlands." Thomas felt McCain stiffen beside him at the sound of that voice. His father's breathing had gone shallow, like a man who'd seen a ghost walk out of an old grave. They crept closer to the light, using the shadows and broken rocks for cover. Thomas could see them now, for men sitting around a small fire, their faces hard and weathered by years of living outside the law. Saddlebags full of stolen gold lay scattered around the fire, and their horses stood tied to iron rings driven into the stone walls. And there, with his back to them, sat the man they had been hunting. Black Jack Morrison, wanted dead or alive for 20 years of blood and theft. Even from behind, Thomas could see the power in the man's shoulders, the way the others looked to him for guidance like iron filings drawn to a magnet. McCain raised his rifle, and his voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Federal lawmen, you're surrounded." The outlaws scrambled for their weapons, but McCain's voice stopped them cold. "Don't even think about it, Jake." Jake Morrison turned slowly, and Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet like sand in an earthquake. The man's face was older than the drawing on the wanted poster, lined with years and marked by weather, but the eyes were the same. Dark eyes that Thomas had seen every morning in the mirror since he was old enough to shave. Morrison looked at McCain, and something passed between them that Thomas didn't understand. Recognition, pain, and something that might have been love or might have been hate. "Hello, Frank," Morrison said quietly, using McCain's first name like they were old friends meeting on the street instead of lawman and outlaw facing each other across 20 years of bad choices. "Jake." McCain's voice was steady, but Thomas could see his father's hand shaking. "It's over. Send your boys out with their hands up." Morrison smiled, a sad expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Is it over, Frank?" "Really?" He looked past McCain to where Thomas stood in the shadows, and the smile faded. "My God, look how he's grown." Thomas felt cold spread through his chest like ice water in his veins. "What's he talking about, Pa?" The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. McCain's rifle wavered, and for the first time in Thomas's life, his father looked old and small and afraid. "Tell him, Frank," Morrison said softly. "Tell the boy who his real father is." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his knees weak. He looked from Morrison to McCain and back again, seeing the truth written in their faces like words carved in stone. "No," Thomas whispered, but even as he said it, he could see the resemblance. The dark hair, the stubborn chin, the restless energy that had always burned in his chest like an unquenchable fire. McCain's rifle dropped to his side, and his voice came out broken and raw. "I was going to tell you, son. When you were older. When you were ready." "Ready for what?" Thomas's voice cracked like a boy's, though he stood taller than both men who claimed him. "Ready to know that the man I've been hunting is my father? Ready to know that everything I believed about myself was a lie." Morrison took a step forward, his hands empty and open. "Thomas, that's your name, isn't it? Your mother told me once that if we had a son, she wanted to call him Thomas." "Don't." Thomas raised his pistol, his hand steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "Don't you dare talk about her." But Morrison kept talking, his voice gentle as rain on dry earth. "Sarah Morrison. She was the most beautiful woman in 3 territories, and she loved you more than life itself. When she was dying, she made Frank promise to raise you right, to keep you away from this life." Thomas looked at McCain, seeing the truth in his father's, no, his guardian's, eyes. 20 years of careful lies and loving deception, all unraveling like a rope left too long in the sun. The sound of boots on stone echoed through the mine as Carson and Blake appeared from the back in trance, their rifles trained on the other outlaws. But Thomas barely noticed them. His world had narrowed to just 3 people and the terrible truth that hung between them like a blade. And in that moment, standing in the darkness of an abandoned mine with a gun in his hand and his heart breaking like glass, Thomas McCain realized that everything he thought he knew about justice and family and the difference between right and wrong was about to change forever. The rain came down on Willow Creek like a blessing the desert had been waiting for all summer. It drummed against the jailhouse windows and turned the dusty streets into rivers of red mud that flowed between the buildings like old blood. Thomas sat in McCain's chair, staring at his own reflection in the Water Street glass, seeing a stranger's face looking back at him. 3 days had passed since the mine. 3 days since the world had cracked open and shown him the lie that had been his life. Black Jack Morrison sat in the cell behind him, quiet as death, while his gang had been shipped off to Tucson to face federal justice. But the real reckoning was still to come, sitting heavy in the air between Thomas and the only father he had ever known. McCain stood by the coffee pot, his hands shaking as he poured 2 cups that neither of them would drink. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap at the first wrong word. "I reckon you got questions," McCain said finally, his voice rough as sandpaper on pine. Thomas turned away from the window, seeing McCain clearly for the first time in 3 days. The man looked older somehow, like the weight of 20 years of secrets had finally caught up with his shoulders. Gray threaded through his hair that Thomas had never noticed before, and lines mapped his face like dry creek beds after a drought. "Just one," Thomas said quietly. "Why?" McCain set down his coffee cup and walked to the window where Thomas had been sitting. Outside, the rain washed the dust from everything, making the world look clean and new. But inside the jailhouse, the air felt thick with old ghosts and older pain. "It's a long story, son. I got time." McCain was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain fall on the street where Thomas had learned to walk, where he had played as a boy while McCain worked at keeping the peace. When he spoke again, his voice was soft as the rain against the glass. "Your mother was 19 when I first met her. Sarah Morrison. She was working at the hotel in Silver Springs, serving meals to travelers and trying to save enough money to get back east to her family. Prettiest woman I'd ever seen, with dark hair like yours and eyes that could make a man forget his own name." Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the mention of his mother. He had asked about her over the years, but McCain had always said she died when Thomas was too young to remember. Another lie, soft as a lullaby and just as comforting. Jack Morrison came through Silver Springs that winter, McCain continued. He wasn't an outlaw then, just a drifter with fast hands and a smile that could charm birds from trees. Sarah fell for him hard and fast, the way young women do when they think they've found their fairy tale. The sheriff moved away from the window and sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk. Thomas had seen him sit in that chair 1,000 times, but now he looked small in it, like a man wearing clothes that no longer fit. They were married by the circuit preacher that spring. Jake was working odd jobs around town, talking about buying some land and settling down. For a while, it looked like love might be enough to tame the wildness in him. But it wasn't, Thomas said, though it wasn't really a question. McCain shook his head. Jake got mixed up with some bad men passing through town. Started with little things, helping them scout bank security, holding horses while they did their business. By the time Sarah realized what was happening, it was too late. Jake was in too deep to get out clean. Thunder rolled across the desert outside, low and rumbling like the voice of God, grown tired of human foolishness. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to picture his mother, but all he could see was the face in McCain's old photographs, a woman with gentle eyes and a smile that looked like it knew secrets worth keeping. "She was carrying you when Jake rode out with his new partners," McCain said. "Told her he'd come back for her when things settled down, when he'd made enough money to take care of his family proper. She waited for him all through that winter, growing bigger with child and smaller with hope. He never came back. Oh, he came back. Came back with blood on his hands and a price on his head that meant he couldn't stay long enough to see his son born." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at McCain, seeing the pain there like a wound that had never properly healed. "What happened to her?" "Childbirth fever took her 3 days after you were born." McCain's voice cracked like ice breaking up in spring. "She held you once, kissed your forehead, and made me promise to keep you safe. Keep you away from the life your father had chosen." The rain kept falling, washing away the dust and grime, but not the hurt that sat like a stone in Thomas's chest. He tried to imagine his mother dying alone, except for McCain, tried to picture himself as a baby small enough to hold in one pair of gentle hands. Jake knew. He knew. Came to see her grave a few days later, alone and careful as a ghost. Found you sleeping on my kitchen table, all wrapped up in the blanket your mother made. He stood there for the longest time, just looking at you like he was trying to memorize your face. McCain got up and walked to an old wooden cabinet that stood against the far wall. He opened a drawer that Thomas had never seen unlocked and pulled out a yellowed envelope, creased and worn from years of handling. He left this for you. Said to give it to you when you were old enough to understand that sometimes love means letting go of the things you want most. Thomas took the envelope with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. His name was written on the front in handwriting he didn't recognize, but somehow knew, like a song half-remembered from childhood. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded small and soft from age. The words were simple, written in the same careful hand. Thomas, if you're reading this, then Frank kept his promise and you grew up safe and good. I want to be your father, but I made choices that closed that door forever. Frank McCain is a better man than I ever was or ever could be. Call him father and mean it. He earned that right through 20 years of love that I threw away in one night of foolishness. Your mother loved you enough to die, bringing you into this world. Don't let my sins keep you from living in it. Jack Morrison Thomas read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. The paper felt heavy in his hands, weighted down with regret and love and the kind of sorrow that comes from seeing a life that might have been. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. McCain sat back down, looking every one of his 53 years. Because I was scared. I was scared that if you knew the truth, you might decide that blood was thicker than the water that raised you. Scared that you might choose to follow him instead of the path your mother died, hoping you'd walk. You really think I'd throw away everything you taught me for a man I never knew? I think you're 18 years old and still figuring out who you want to be. I think the world has a way of making men choose between what they want and what they need, and I was afraid you might choose wrong. Thomas stood up and walked to the cell where Black Jack Morrison sat on the narrow cot, staring at the floor like it held answers to questions he'd been asking all his life. The outlaw looked up when Thomas approached, and again the young deputy saw his own eyes looking back at him. He's going to hang, isn't he? Thomas asked without turning around. Probably. Judge Hawkins doesn't have much mercy for bank robbers and killers. And if he doesn't, then he'll spend what's left of his life in prison, which might be worse than hanging for a man who's lived his whole life under an open sky. Thomas pressed his face against the iron bars, close enough to smell the desert dust and horse sweat that clung to Morrison like a second skin. The outlaw didn't look like a monster. He looked tired and sad and old before his time, like a man who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. What are you thinking, son? Thomas turned back to McCain, seeing the fear in the older man's eyes. Fear that the boy he'd raised might choose the blood that made him over the love that shaped him. Fear that 20 years of careful tending might be undone by one night of truth-telling. But when Thomas spoke, his voice was steady and sure, like a man who'd finally found his footing on shifting ground. I'm thinking that some choices can't be undone, no matter how much we wish they could be. I'm thinking that the man who sat by my bedside when I had fever, who taught me to ride and shoot and tell right from wrong, who loved me even when I wasn't his blood, that man is my father in every way that matters. McCain's shoulders sagged with relief, and Thomas saw tears in the older man's eyes that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with gratitude. But I'm also thinking, Thomas continued, looking back at the cell where Morrison sat listening to every word, that maybe it's time I understood what it really means to choose between justice and mercy. The dawn came slow and red over Willow Creek, painting the desert sky the color of old wounds. Thomas stood at the window of the jailhouse, watching the sun climb above the mountains while the town stirred to life around him. 3 days had passed since the rain, and the streets were dry again, dust already beginning to settle back into the places water had washed clean. Behind him, Black Jack Morrison sat on the edge of his cot, hands folded in his lap like a man at prayer. The outlaw hadn't spoken much since that night, when the truth came spilling out like blood from a cut vein. He just sat and waited the way men wait when they know their time is running short. Judge Hawkins will be here today, Thomas said without turning from the window. I know. Morrison's voice was quiet, roughened by years of campfire smoke and hard living. Frank told me yesterday. Thomas closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of morning. Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch. The blacksmith's hammer ringing against iron. Children laughing as they chased each other to school. All the sounds of a world going on with its business while two men sat in a jailhouse and wrestled with the weight of blood and justice. You scared? Thomas asked. Morrison was quiet for a long time, long enough that Thomas thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words came out soft as dust settling. Not of dying. I made peace with that a long time ago. Every man who lives by the gun knows how his story ends. He paused, and Thomas heard the creak of the cot as Morrison shifted his weight. I'm scared of what I never got to say. Scared of leaving things unfinished. Thomas turned away from the window and really looked at his father for the first time since that night in the mine. Morrison was smaller than he'd seemed in the darkness, worn down by 20 years of running and hiding and looking over his shoulder. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his hands bore the scars of a life lived hard and fast. But his eyes were the same eyes Thomas saw in the mirror every morning, dark and restless and full of dreams that might never come true. What would you say? Thomas asked. If you had the words? Morrison stood up and walked to the bars that separated them, wrapping his fingers around the cold iron like a man grasping at something he could never hold. I'd tell you about your mother. Really tell you, not just the facts that Frank gave you. I'd tell you how she laughed like water running over stones, and how she could make biscuits that tasted like heaven itself. I'd tell you how she used to sing while she worked, old songs her grandmother taught her back in Kentucky. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, a pain that was part loss and part longing for a woman he'd never known but somehow missed every day of his life. She had freckles across her nose that she tried to cover with powder. Morrison continued, his voice growing softer with memory. And she could outcook any woman in 3 territories, but she burned coffee every single time because she'd get distracted reading books while it was brewing. Tell me more. Morrison smiled, the first real smile Thomas had seen from him. She talked to herself when she was thinking hard about something. Used to pace around the kitchen, having whole conversations with people who weren't there while she worked through whatever problem was weighing on her mind. Thomas found himself smiling too, picturing this woman who was nothing more than a name and a grave marker, but who suddenly felt real enough to touch. She wanted to name you after her father, Morrison said. Thomas Jefferson Morrison was his name, though everyone just called him Tom. He died in the war when she was little, but she remembered him reading to her from a big book of poetry. Said she wanted her son to grow up loving words the way her father did. Doi? Thomas asked. Love words, I mean. You tell me. You're the one living with them every day. Thomas thought about all the books McCain had brought him over the years, all the evenings spent reading by lamplight while the desert wind howled outside their windows. He thought about how words could paint pictures in his mind more vivid than anything his eyes had ever seen. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess I do. They stood there in silence for a while, father and son separated by iron bars and 20 years of choices that couldn't be undone. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build toward another scorching day. Thomas, Morrison said finally, I need you to know something. The life I chose, the things I've done, none of that was because I didn't love you and your mother. I thought I could make enough money fast enough to come back and be the husband and father you both deserved. But one bad choice led to another, and before I knew it, I was in so deep that turning back would have meant bringing all my enemies straight to your door. So you stayed away. So I stayed away. Told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is I was protecting myself too. Protecting myself from having to face what I'd thrown away. Thomas heard footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside and looked through the window to see Judge Hawkins walking toward the jailhouse, his black coat flapping in a morning breeze like the wings of some great bird. Behind him came a small crowd of townspeople, drawn by the prospect of justice being served on one of the most wanted men in the territory. Time's up, Thomas said. Morrison nodded and sat back down on his cot, straightening his shoulders like a man preparing to meet his fate with whatever dignity he had left. McCain came through the door, his face grave and tired. He looked from Thomas to Morrison and back again, reading the weight of the conversation that hung in the air between them. "Judge is here," McCain said simply. "I know." Thomas looked at the badge pinned to his vest, the same tin star he'd dreamed of wearing since he was 12 years old, and believed the world was divided cleanly between good men and bad ones. "Pa, can I ask you something?" McCain nodded. "If you were me, what would you do?" The older man was quiet for a long time, his weathered hands working at the brim of his hat like he was trying to shape it into something that made sense. "I'd remember that mercy ain't the same thing as justice," McCain said finally. "But I'd also remember that justice ain't always the same thing as revenge." Judge Hawkins entered the jailhouse with the authority of a man who'd spent 40 years deciding the fates of other men. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by any of it. "Sheriff McCain," the judge said, nodding to the older man. "I understand we have Jack Morrison in custody." "Yes, sir." "Been here 3 days, quiet as you please." Hawkins looked at Morrison through the bars, taking in the measure of the man who'd been terrorizing banks and stagecoaches for the better part of 2 decades. "Jack Morrison," the judge said formally, "you stand accused of bank robbery, murder, and crimes against the territory. How do you answer these charges?" Morrison stood up and faced the judge with his chin raised and his shoulders straight. "Guilty as charged, Your Honor." Every word of it. A murmur went through the crowd that had gathered outside the jailhouse. Thomas could see their faces pressed against the windows, hungry for the drama of justice being served. "Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Morrison looked at Thomas, then at McCain, then back at the judge. "Just that I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. Sorry for the families I hurt. Sorry for the fear I spread. And sorry most of all for the son I never learned how to love properly." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as Judge Hawkins prepared to speak the words that would seal Morrison's fate. This was the moment he'd been building toward his whole life. The moment when justice would be served and another outlaw would pay for his crimes. But as he looked at Morrison standing there, hands steady and eyes clear, Thomas realized that justice wasn't as simple as he'd always believed. This wasn't just Black Jack Morrison, notorious outlaw. This was Jack Morrison, the man who'd loved his mother enough to let her go. The man who'd stayed away to keep his family safe, even though it meant giving up everything he'd ever wanted. "Your Honor," Thomas heard himself say, and was surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "I'd like to say something." Judge Hawkins raised an eyebrow. "You're Deputy McCain, aren't you? The one who helped bring Morrison in?" "Yes, sir." "Then speak your piece." Thomas looked around the jailhouse, seeing McCain's worried face, Morrison's resigned acceptance, and the crowd outside pressing closer to hear what he would say. He thought about the boy he'd been, dreaming of justice served clean and simple. He thought about the man he'd become, understanding that real justice was messy, and more complicated than any child could imagine. "Jack Morrison is guilty of the crimes he's charged with," Thomas said clearly. "But he's also the father who chose to stay away, so his son could grow up safe and good. He's the man who could have taken me from the only home I've ever known, but didn't. He's guilty, but he's also spent 20 years paying for his mistakes in ways the law never could have punished him." Judge Hawkins listened without interrupting, his sharp eyes taking in every word. "I'm not asking for his crimes to be forgotten," Thomas continued, "but I am asking for his sacrifice to be remembered. He gave up everything that mattered to him so that I could have a chance at a better life. That has to count for something." The jailhouse was quiet except for the tick of the old clock on the wall and the sound of Thomas's heart beating like a drum in his chest. Outside, the crowd waited for justice or mercy, not knowing which they wanted more. Judge Hawkins was quiet for a long time, studying Morrison's face as if he could read the man's soul in the lines around his eyes. "Jack Morrison," the judge said finally, "you are guilty of the crimes charged against you. But in consideration of the circumstances presented and the genuine remorse you've shown, I sentence you to 20 years hard labor in the territorial prison. You'll have a chance to work off your debt to society and maybe, if you're lucky, live to see your son grown into the man he's already becoming. Morrison's knees buckled with relief, and he grabbed the bars to keep himself upright. Thomas felt his own legs go weak, and McCain's hand settled on his shoulder like an anchor in a storm. As the judge prepared the paperwork and the crowd began to disperse, Morrison looked at Thomas through the bars one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as McCain unlocked the cell to put Morrison in shackles for the trip to prison, and realized that this was what it meant to be a man, not the absence of fear or doubt, but the willingness to make hard choices even when your hand was shaking. As the prison wagon pulled away from Willow Creek, Thomas stood in the doorway of the jailhouse and watched the dust settle behind it. He thought about the boy he'd been, so certain about right and wrong, and the man he was becoming, learning that sometimes the hardest thing about justice is knowing when to temper it with mercy. The sun climbed higher over the desert, painting everything in shades of gold and red, and Thomas McCain, son of two fathers and heir to both their legacies, stepped into the light of a new day, ready to write his own story in the endless book of the American West. The sun climbed higher over the desert, painting everything in shades of gold and red, and Thomas McCain, son of two fathers and heir to both their legacies, stepped into the light of a new day, ready to write his own story in the endless book of the American West.